Who are the Arabs? What unites them? What divides them? There are 160 million people who call themselves Arabs. They live in not one, but 21 sovereign states, strung across Asia and Africa, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Arabian Gulf. They are not a distinct race. There are black Arabs and white Arabs. They do not share the same religion. There are Muslim Arabs and Christian Arabs. 14 centuries ago, the answer to the question, who are the Arabs, would have been simple. They were the people who lived in the Arabian Peninsula and spoke Arabic. A century later, inspired by the new religion of Islam, they had become the rulers of a vast empire, stretching from Spain to Persia. In time, the majority of people within that empire converted to Islam. And from Morocco to Iraq, Arabic gradually replaced the languages used before, becoming equally the language of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Our films show the Arab past as it still informs the life and imagination of Arabs today. The tensions between a proud history and a recent past of deep disappointment inspire the questions that the Arabs continuously ask of themselves. In this first film, we will travel to the four corners of the Arab world to seek the meaning of Arabness and the deep sources that sustain it. We begin in Beirut, the city where I grew up. Since 1965, when I went to America to study, I have been one of Lebanon's many prodigal sons, returning annually to visit family and friends. In the last 100 years, we Lebanese have become almost notorious for our inability to stay put. Recently, the wars which have ravaged our country have forced many of us to live abroad, to become Lebanese who visit Lebanon. كيفك؟
كيفك أنت؟
هاي.
هاي. خالو مامي. خالو.
Every year in recent history has left such a savage mark on the familiar places and the faces. Beirut has to be known all over again. My father and mother survived the latest season of destruction in Beirut alone. All of their 7 children were outside Lebanon, scattered wide, in Britain, Nigeria, Greece, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. Until the civil war of 1975, they had lived in Beirut close to their parents. Through civil war and invasion, my father opened his shop every day. Despite everything, he held firm to the rhythms of normality.
جاي نزورك ونصور جديدة. كيف الحال؟ كيف؟ كيفك عملت منيح؟ كيفك؟ يلا.
Our family comes from the town of Marjayoun in South Lebanon. We always belong here, no matter what distance or absence has intervened.
لولو فوق مرحبا كيف الحال؟
لا والله بدي اقول لك مرتين ثلاثة من فؤاد مسلم كيف الحال؟
Nowadays, Marjayoun is newsworthy as a base for the Haddad militia, the private army organized by Israel to control South Lebanon.
خربان الصحة؟ عم بيصوركم. شو بدي اعمل انا؟ هو عارف فجأة جاي. لولو عرفتي مين انا؟ انا باسم.
باسم مين؟
باسم بن فؤاد.
يا هلا يا هلا. كيفك؟
The family house is occupied by a Haddad militiaman and his family.
عمري اللي عمر ما شفتك. هذا ابن صاحب البيت عندكم.
اللي اجى هو الدكتور.
اللي اجى اللي ما هو الدكتور.
ابوه اللي اجى هو الدكتور.
جربت مكاناتي. هذا باسم المهم هذا.
Political turmoil has been the story of the Middle East for more than 60 years. My father was born here in 1918, the year when the map of the region was changed irrevocably, and the foundations were laid for the conflicts that still rage today. Until 1918, no borders had separated this region for hundreds of years. Haifa and Tripoli, Beirut and Damascus, Jerusalem and Jericho shared a common geography and common culture. For 400 years, this region had been the Syrian provinces of the Ottoman Empire. It remained so even as the Ottoman Empire slowly shrank under the pressure of new European empires and modern nationalisms. By the first decade of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire had become principally an empire of Arabs and Turks. From their capital, Istanbul, the Ottoman authorities tried desperately to preserve the empire by a policy of increased centralization and Turkification. After 400 years of coexistence, the difference in language between Arab and Turk became profoundly significant. Arab nationalism began as a defense of Arabic language and culture. A 100 years ago, a man of Damascus or Beirut might have called himself a Muslim or a Christian, an Ottoman, a Syrian, but it is unlikely he would have called himself an Arab. Arab identity as we know it today developed in the 20th century. In 1914, war broke out in Europe. The Turks entered the war on the side of Germany, and the Middle East became a battleground. The war forced the Syrian Arabs to choose between the Ottoman state and Arab independence. The decision divided many families. Turkish execution of Arabs in Beirut and Damascus helped harden opinion against the Turks. The Arab Revolt of 1916 finally transformed the cultural protest movement into a national uprising. The Arab leaders were encouraged by British promises of support for an independent Arab state. By 1918, the Turks had been defeated, and the British and their Arab allies entered major cities of the region. It seemed the time had arrived for Arab independence. Instead, Britain and France divided the region between themselves, slashing artificial boundaries across the map of geographical Syria. And so the Syrian Arabs entered the world of European rule, which other Arab peoples, Egyptians, Algerians, had long before experienced. These new mandates were controlled for a generation by Britain and France. But when the age of European empire was brought to an end by the Second World War, they gained their independence as individual Arab states. All except one, Palestine. In Palestine, British rule was committed to the establishment of a Jewish homeland. By 1948, the hundreds of thousands of Zionist Jewish settlers who had moved to Palestine were strong enough to defeat the larger Arab population in war. They created the new state of Israel. The states first created by the British and the French now have their own armies, governments, and institutions, their own national identities and interests. The Lebanese can still celebrate their Independence Day in Beirut. But it is an independence of hope, not reality. The events of 1918 and 1948 still cast a dark shadow over the region. The conflicts generated then remain unresolved. At the time of this parade, Lebanon was occupied by the armies of Israel and Syria. Soldiers from Europe and America were trying to keep the peace in Beirut. Private militias held more power in much of the country than the government. A government trying to rebuild the Lebanese state on the rubble of civil war and invasion. Tarif Khalidi has been a friend for 20 years.
Well, we have to get rid of the French at some point, don't we?
I don't think you can ever get rid of the French.
We go to Martyrs Square for the first time since the Civil War began in 1975. It used to be the bustling heart of Beirut.
Since this was supposed to represent the martyrs of the First War.
Hey, right. But I don't think they should touch it. I really don't think they should touch it at all. And they shouldn't plug the holes in it, is what I mean. The hand of this guy, Shaif, has fallen off.
Incredible.
Makes him look like a Roman emperor or something.
The wars that have ravaged Lebanon have much to do with the fact that the various Lebanese groups have failed to solve some essential internal problems of modern statehood. But they are unlikely to have a real chance to do so successfully, as long as the whole area remains caught in the turmoil which the events of 1918 and 1948 generated. The problems of statehood and sovereignty should be settled with justice. Otherwise, Lebanese, Palestinians, Syrians, and Israelis will continue to live under conditions of conflict without any real chance of development towards truly humane societies. Miraculously, although its old commercial heart has been torn from it, Beirut is still alive, even vibrant. In the 19th and 20th century, Beirut's institutions of learning and journalism played a central role in the Arab cultural renaissance. And it is in Beirut that some of the major intellectual and political battles of the Arabs have been fought. It is here, for example, that the name of Gamal Abdel Nasser is still evoked. Nasser is a central figure in the story of Arabism. Perhaps no other modern Arab political figure can be compared with him. Nasser's first concern in the 1940s and early 1950s, and the concern of all Egyptians, was the expulsion of the British from Egypt. But the potential for Arabism had been there all along, in the shared memory of a gloriously united Arab civilization, as well as in the bitter experience of European colonial rule, which most Arab peoples suffered. In the 1950s, Cairo became the major center of the anti-colonial struggle in the Arab world and Africa. The Algerian National Liberation Front had set up its political headquarters there. France was obsessed with Algeria, Britain with its fading imperial glory, Israel with any sign of Arab strength. And they conspired to strike and topple the Nasser regime in 1956. The spectacle of French, Israeli, and British troops being forced to withdraw from Egypt increased Nasser's influence and popularity.
What he did not realize that by this very act of defying the West, he was galvanizing the rest of the Arab world. He did not count on it, he did not anticipate it, but it happened. And when it happened, he began to realize in a very dramatic way that there is something that explains his early feelings of Arabism. He began to realize that here is a potential force that could definitely be utilized, mobilized, not only for Egyptian interest, but for the interest of his fight against colonialism and against imperialism.
Egypt had emerged as the champion of pan-Arab nationalism. In 1958, the creation of the United Arab Republic of Egypt and Syria consummated these developments. It is impossible to understand the present-day mood of political frustration, defeatism, and impotence among Arabs without reference to the climate of political optimism only 20 years ago. But the union of Egypt and Syria lasted 3 years. And after Israel attacked and utterly defeated the armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in 1967, the combined forces of Israel, the West, and the anti-Nasser Arabs succeeded in containing Egypt and introduced into Egyptian politics the fateful seeds of retreat from Nasser's Arab policies. Nasser died in 1970. 6 million Egyptians and other Arabs marched in his Cairo funeral. At the greatest moment of his life, in November 1956, he went to Cairo's great Azhar Mosque to speak to his people.
شعارنا أننا سنقاتل ولن نسلم. ده شعار كل فرد في القوات المسلحة وده شعار كل فرد في الشعب. هنقاتل. أنا هنا في القاهرة ضد أي غزو سأقاتل معاكم. أنا هنا موجود في القاهرة، ولادي موجودون معاكم في القاهرة، ما طلعتهمش بره ومش هطلعهم بره، وأنا موجود معاكم هنا في القاهرة. هنقاتل زي ما قلت لكم امبارح لآخر نقطة دم. لن نسلم أبدا. بنبني بلدنا، نبني تاريخنا، بنبني مستقبلنا.
The Azhar, a mosque and a university, is at the heart of Cairo, a living monument to the historical traditions common to all Arab societies. Although not all Arabs are Muslims, Islam has a special place in Arab history and culture. The founder of Islam was the Prophet Muhammad, who proclaimed he was the messenger of God's word, as previously revealed to Abraham, Moses, and Jesus.
Allahu Akbar.
Every year, Muslims make pilgrimage to Mecca, a place which Muslims associate with Abraham, the patriarch of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It was here that the Prophet Muhammad was born about 1400 years ago, and where he began his mission. The faith revealed to Muhammad in Mecca equipped the Arabs for one of the most remarkable achievements in history. They founded a state and conquered a vast empire. Within that empire, a new world civilization was created. Within a century, the Arab Islamic Empire occupied the center of the known world. The area of the early Arab conquests is basically the area of the modern Arab world, with the exception of Spain and Iran. The Arabs built their first great monument in Jerusalem. Within a generation of the Prophet's death, they moved their capital from Medina to Damascus. The Great Umayyad Mosque at first shared the site of a Christian church, which itself had been built on the site of a Roman temple. The Arabs ruled in Damascus for 100 years. Then the capital was moved to Baghdad, a new city founded near the site of ancient Babylon. Arab Islamic civilization was built on the foundations of the great civilizations of the Middle East which had preceded it. The civilizations of the Babylonians and Pharaohs, Assyrians and Persians, the Greeks and Romans. The Arab Islamic Empire started to lose central control very early. But it was precisely in the period of endless political upheaval that Arab Islamic civilization took its mature classical form. Political fragmentation had little effect on the vigorous growth of Arab culture, especially in the cities. Places like Damascus, Baghdad, Fez, and Cairo. In the 20th century, Arabness as a cultural identity has fared much better than its political manifestations. It is a great paradox that today the Arab world is much more solidly integrated, economically, socially, and culturally, than it ever was in Nasser's time. Political Arabism peaked too soon. Through language and education, Arabic culture continues to form the personality and outlook of an ever-increasing number of Arabs. For the Arabs, poetry is the most effective form of self-expression.
فنذهب فيها كجرحين في جرس مثقل يعبران الجبال إلى القدس.
مفتاح آخر دار فلم يفتح، دارت كل مفاتيح الدنيا لم يفتح، لكن يدا حانية طرقت، سقط الباب وذابت حبات القلب.
كان محله هنا؟
كان هنا وبعدين لما بدأوا يبنوا كان عبقري يعني. بالعربي كان عبقري فظيع يعني كان.
Gamal al-Ghitani, an Egyptian writer, shows me his Cairo. The neighborhood of the Azhar where he grew up. For 1,000 years, merchants from all over the Arab world came to Cairo for their trade. Scholars and artists have produced work here that has influenced Arabs everywhere.
كان بيدرس في الأزهر. بعدين لا شكرا خلينا واقفين احسن. الكرسي
ده قاعد عليها كده. اولاد صغار. ده كرسي. نفس وضعه حتى. نفس وضع الكرسي.
20th century Cairo has played an equally important role. By far the most popular Arab artist of the first half of the 20th century was the Egyptian singer Kulthum. Egyptian books, films, television programs, and music are consumed by all speakers of Arabic.
ودلوقتي
تأكدت إن العالم كبير، أكبر بكتير من مخ أي واحد فينا. ده فيه 3000 مليون مخ. على العموم نبقى نتناقش في آرائك دي.
على العموم نبقى نتناقش في آرائك دي بعدين. لحسن شايفاهم جم دلوقتي ودخلوا في الأوضة التانية، ودلوقتي هيدخلوا الاجتماع. وأرجوك
ظهر رجل واحد ليكتب أروع صفحات التاريخ، الناصر صلاح الدين. رمز العدالة الحي ومثلها الخالد، رسول الحق وحميه وسيفه البطار.
يا محمد يا حبيبي يا حبيبي، إمام المرسلين إمام المرسلين إمام المرسلين والمجاهدين، إمام المرسلين الشاهدين إمام الشاهدين إمام الشاهدين إمام الخائفين إمام المنذرين إمام المنذرين والمبشرين.
أتيح لي أن أسافر إلى عدد من البلدان العربية: المغرب، بغداد، دمشق، بيروت، والسودان، والتقيت بنفس الكتاب من أبناء جيلي ونفس الكتاب اللي ابتدوا معانا وتميزوا بكتاباتهم، وكنت أفاجأ إنه الهموم واحدة. وعندما كنت ألتقي ببعضهم مثلا في المغرب التي تقع في أقصى القارة الإفريقية، أو في بغداد أو في دمشق أو في بيروت، كنا نبدأ الحديث ونحن نلتقي للمرة الأولى وكأننا فارقنا بعض منذ البارحة. وحدة الهم
ده شيء، يعني ده شيء كان موجود من 100 سنة فكرك، أو شيء جديد أو شيء تطور، أو يعني يعني هل الوحدة العربية ما صارتش، بل في وحدة هموم صارت؟
أنا بعتقد إنه من 4 قرون كانت في وحدة عربية حقيقية. يمكن ما كانش في بعض المشاكل الموجودة الآن. على سبيل المثال، تخيل أن ابن بطوطة انطلق من طنجة الآن وقام برحلته. كم جمرك سيوقفه، وكم مخفر وكم فيزا وإلى آخره.
A modern world of national boundaries, passports, and customs regulations hinders, but cannot stop, the inexorably growing links of culture and economy among the different Arab societies. The Gulf states have been transformed beyond recognition by the new wealth from oil.
لا بعدين نرد عليه. أول الدكاكين هذول اللي عندهم بصر.
Now they are the magnet of attention for the rest of the Arab world. Kuwait, for example, has become a modernizing and dynamic city-state, attracting other Arabs as workers, scientists, professors, and journalists. Some 60% of Kuwait's population are now Palestinians, Lebanese, Egyptians, and other Arabs. Through them, the Arabian Gulf has internalized the 100-year-old modern Arab experience in education, politics, science, the contemporary Arabic language and outlook. In less than 20 years, the Kuwaiti press has become a press for all Arabs.
شوف بطول مصر أستاذ هيدا عن شو؟ برضه عن
This outburst of activity has given a new role to the Kuwaitis. 30 years ago, they were mostly traders and fishermen in a small settlement on the edge of a vast desert. They looked out to India as much as to the Arab heartlands. But today, in a profound way, Arab concerns have become their concerns.
What do you think is the major problem that, if there is one major problem that faces the Arabs today?
Identity, I think. Still identity, yes. Because, again, let me compare what is happening here with what has happened and still happening in the United States. There, a successful melting pot was developed and encouraged consciously by government. Therefore, an immigrant going to the United States would be faced immediately with the need to join in. And the system is so powerfully arranged that an immigrant son is no longer a Romanian or a Pole or an Arab or whatever it is, or English. He is American, and that's it. The system sees to that, and he's absorbed within it. I mean, Europeans are Europeans. Well, there is this concept of Europe. The United States is big enough not to need any other geographic embrace, if you like. Africans are Africans, but what are the Arabs? I mean, what is an Algerian? He must think of himself as something. As an Algerian alone, or as an Egyptian, it's not enough.
At the other end of the Arab world is Morocco. Arab dynasties have ruled here more continuously than in any other part of the Arab world. The European empires which established their presence here did leave their mark. The French ruled Morocco for some 40 years, and there are permanent relationships with Europe and the West common to all Arab societies, the relationships of technology, economics, and political ideas. But there are other questions which are distinctly Arab questions. I know why, coming from the east, from South Lebanon myself, why the Palestine problem is of such enormity and why somebody in Lebanon or Syria or even Egypt, would say something to the effect that the Palestine problem is the major problem of the Arabs. Mm-hmm. Not only we are there, but the Palestinians are amongst us. Yes. It's difficult for me to understand why people in the Maghreb would say that the Palestine problem is the major problem of the Arabs.
That I think that there is a genuine feeling here that what's happening to Palestinians is really happening to us here. I mean, I remember the time when Beirut was bombed, and every defeat, military defeat, etc., I really felt them like mine. Like I was defeated, and beyond ideological reasons, beyond even fighting imperialism, fighting colonial domination, fighting all that. I felt that what was happening to the Palestinians and to the Lebanese was really part of me. What's happening to me, and the feeling I got is the feeling that what can I do? How can I act? Do I have here in Morocco the means to influence the events here? I must say that I didn't find many means, didn't find many solutions.
دي صورة للحادثة.
صورة من هنا. هي بيروت.
In a Cairo flat, Nadia Lutfi confirms how central are the unsolved questions of Palestine and Lebanon to all Arabs. She is a film star. To Arabs, a Sophia Loren or Elizabeth Taylor. But in the summer of 1982, she went to Beirut during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Now she collects photographs and videotapes to record and make public the suffering she had seen.
بقى طول ما قاعد راح اعمل وان شاء الله ما عنديش شغل غير طبعا في التليفون في الشباك في الكاسيت في اي حته انا هفضح العمليه دي ولازم وهي بكلمه جد.
Beirut is just a fragment of it, just one piece of the Middle East problem. It's not the beginning and it's not the end. It's just that the problem is not whether the West notices or not. This is totally not the point what we would like to discuss. The West doesn't give a damn, actually, what happens in this area, except in terms of its own interests, only in its own interests. And this area is getting too much of pain, too much of horror, and too much of violence. The main question we are asking now is how far can you push a people? Be them Palestinians or Lebanese or Egyptians or Arabs as a nation. How far can you push them?
If Arabs today agree on anything, it is that they have little cause for self-congratulation.
As a medieval Arab historian of today, I am called upon to explain the relevance of the Arab past to the Arab present far more urgently than if I had been a European historian of 13th century Germany.
I think in the case of the Arabs, perhaps there's a special explanation in terms of why the past becomes so relevant. Because Arab identity today depends a great deal on history.
Identity is always negotiable. I can be at one time Arab, at another time a Muslim, at a third time a Palestinian. And it frequently depends on external pressure. Those things that pushed me to become Palestinian, which is what I am, can at other times push me to become an Arab. I can feel myself to belong to an Arab world, which historically speaking has played a decisive and central role in the evolution of world history. So I am an Arab, but I'm also a world citizen. The Arab nation has always been part of world culture.
I know.
Cousins of the Greeks, cousins of the Persians, cousins of the Turks, in that sense, we've always been world citizens.
No, I'm talking about something very specific. If Beirut burns and I was tied to Beirut, I perhaps can find a teaching job somewhere else. Can my people, in that sense, I'm a citizen of the world, I can speak English, I can go here or there. But can my people as a whole find a job elsewhere? In Philadelphia, in the United States, can they as a whole? And ultimately the question is, can I really have an identity, whether Arab, Muslim, Palestinian, Lebanese, Maronite, whatever? Can I really have an identity separate from the fate of my people?
All through the summer, there was a war being waged in an Arab country against Arabs, and the entire Arab world, which we've been talking about is so important and so powerful, did absolutely nothing. The entire Arab world just sat there in political terms. Now, I've visited some of the countries after the war, and I found that people were very moved. But nothing else moved. There were no demonstrations. There was no political action. Well, Europe showed more solidarity with the British over the Falklands than, which, was an affair which involved how many hundred people, how many thousand people, than the Arab world showed over Lebanon, which is an affair that involved the lives of several million people. and ended the lives of several tens of thousands of people. I mean, you go to Egypt and you find people really worked up about it. You go to Tunis or you go to Damascus and you find people really worked up about it. The newspapers are really full of it. Everybody's reading it and watching it on television and moved by it. But the official structures that supposedly represent the Arab world are apparently more in tune with Washington than they are with their own people, or something like that.
But that simply means that the official Arab world is not moving. It doesn't mean that the Arab peoples are not moving. In other words, that the distinction ought to be made when one talks about Arab reactions between how the Arab regimes reacted to X event and how the Arab peoples reacted.
It's so depressing to see year after year, and war after war, and crisis after crisis, and massacre after massacre, and country after country being torn up. This wonderful potential just doesn't seem to be actualized, decade after decade after decade. I think we're going backwards.
My hypothesis is that the whole concept that we are Arabs does not mean that we are a nation. It means we are a culture. And I take the notion of a culture in the classical Arabic sense of the thing, that is, we are many things in one thing. We are not a nation in the European terminology where France is France, that is, it's a very central, culturally very central society. We have to take Arabism as a cultural dimension and not as a European national concept.
Okay, you have this wonderful cultural diversity and plurality and all this stuff, and there's Arab culture, fine, very good. But what's happening in the world today is that you have groups of nations slowly integrating, because that's the only way in which certain political and economic things can be achieved in the world today. I mean, you cannot have the kind of autonomy that most people want. You cannot have the kind of use of their resources that most people expect, given the kind of political and economic fragmentation you have. What I'm trying to say is that if there's not some minimal integrative success, then a lot of things that people take for granted are just going to be unavailable in the Arab world, and you're going to continue to have a drain of talent away from this part of the world.
I think part of the sense of despair really results from the taste of accomplishment. I mean, it is only when you begin feeling that an Arab world truly exists that you begin complaining about the fact that the Arabs don't cooperate, that they are, all these things. Quite often we talk about the Arab world as if it existed and has been disintegrating. And we really don't notice that an Arab world in that sense, a place in which people in Morocco knew what Egyptian sounds like, or knew anything about what's happening in Lebanon, never existed before. That has been happening. That has been an accomplishment of the 20th century. It is also important to remember the extent to which we really have not had an Arab world in which we had a citizen